afternoon. I want to talk to you a little bit today about irrational behavior, and I'll talk to you about one particular irrational behavior. Of course, there are many. But before I do that, I want to tell you how I started thinking about irrationality. Quite a few years ago, I got badly injured in an explosion, and as a consequence, I was for about 3 years in hospital. One of the most difficult things about being in hospital for any burn patient is the process of bandage removal. Now, you all must have taken a Band-Aid off at some point, and you all must have wondered, what's the right way to take a bandage off? Do you rip it off quickly, take just a few seconds, but each of them is very painful, or do you take it off slowly? You take many seconds, but each of them is not as painful. And the question that occupied me a lot in those days was, which one of those is the better approach? The nurses in my department thought that the ripping approach was a better approach. And because I had about 70% of my body burned, it was a very painful process. They would grab hold of a bandage, and they would rip it, and they would grab hold of the next one, and they would rip it, and it would continue doing so for about an hour. And in these moments of tearing and pain, I would often try to plead with them and beg them to try and do something else, to try and take it slower, make it less painful, take more time. But the nurses told me two things. The first thing they said was that they were correct, that they knew what was the right approach to minimize my pain. And the second thing is they said that the word patient doesn't mean to butt in or intervene or make suggestions. I don't know how it is in Spanish. I'm guessing it's the same meaning, that patients are supposed to be passive. Well, they kept on doing what they thought was the right thing to do. And about 3 years later, when I left hospital, I started studying at the university. And one of the most interesting lessons I learned was about the experimental method. I learned that if you have a question about something in life, you can perhaps bring it into the lab, you can create the conditions to test it out, and you might find out the answer to your question. I was still very concerned with this question of how do you take bandages of burn patients to minimize their pain. Initially, I didn't have much money for research, so I went to a hardware store and I bought a carpenter's vise, one of those things that you use to hold pieces of wood together. And I set it up in a lab, and I would invite people in, and I asked them to put 2 fingers in this vise, and I would slightly crunch their fingers. And I would crunch people's fingers in many versions: short duration, long duration, pain that went up, pain that went down, with breaks, without breaks. And after each of those painful experiences, I would ask people, so how painful was this, and how painful was that? And if I had to give you one of those 2 painful experiences again, which one would you prefer? People made choices. I got a paper published, then I got more research money. I got some grants. I moved to better equipment, electrical shocks and sounds and heat. This is what happens when you research progress. But what I learned at the end of all of those experiments with all of those methods was that the nurses were wrong in multiple ways. First of all, it turns out that in the trade-off between duration and intensity, duration doesn't matter as much, while intensity matters a lot. You take an experience, you make it twice as long, it doesn't become twice as pleasurable or twice as painful. You change the amplitude, now you're really talking about changing it. Even very small changes make a big change. The nurses didn't realize that the progression of pain over time matters a lot. Pain that starts low and ends up high is perceived as much worse than pain that starts high and ends up low. And for convenience purposes, mostly the nurses started my feet and ended up with my head. That gave me the wrong progression of pain over time. And finally, what they didn't understand was that for prolonged periods of pain, it's very good to have breaks. It's very good to have periods when we can kind of recuperate our energy and be able to tackle on the next period of pain. And the question was, how could the nurses get it wrong? Here were good, kind-hearted people who wanted the best for me. Nevertheless, they were making mistakes. And it wasn't as if one nurse was making one mistake, another nurse was making another mistake, or one day they were doing something this way, one day they were doing something the other. It was a consistent mistake. All of them were behaving in the same way, day in and day out, for all the patients. And I started wondering if nurses are the only people in the world who make systematically and predictable mistakes. And the answer is probably not. And therefore, I started studying all kinds of aspects in life, which I think people have this tendency to believe one thing when reality is actually quite different. So I want to tell you about one such research topic, and I'll talk about cheating. And I'm interested in cheating because I think it helps explain some things about the recent financial crisis, but I think especially these days it also can give us some insights about corruption and behavior in society more generally. So I became interested in cheating after Enron. You probably all remember Enron. Here was a big event where we kind of started thinking about corruption in a modern way. This wasn't the first case, but it got me thinking. And the basic question in my mind was, what was happening in Enron? Is this a case of 3 bad apples, of 3 people who kind of designing a system to take advantage of people, or is it something more systematic? Now, if it's just 3 bad apples, all we need to do is to make sure we don't hire bad apples in the future. But if it's something more systematic, maybe we need to think about the system that created it. So as a psychologist, you know, the kind of things I do is I do very simple experiments. So let's think about one experiment. I design a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems, and I pass them around to people. These are problems that everybody can solve given enough time, but I don't give people enough time. So if you're in the experiment, I would pass these sheets up. I would say, I'll pay you $1 per question that you get correctly. You have 5 minutes, go. You will start working very hard to solve these questions. At the end of the 5 minutes, I would say, stop. Let's see how many questions you got correctly, and I'll pay you for that. On average, people solve 4 problems. We pay them $4. That's the control condition. In the experimental condition, we pass this sheet up. Everybody starts. At the end of 5 minutes, I say, stop. Shred the piece of paper. Put the pieces in your pocket or in your backpack, and tell me how many questions you got correctly. Now the average response goes up to 6. Now when you look at the distribution of those responses, it's not as if we have some outliers, some people who cheat a lot and they pull the mean. Instead, we see that lots of people are cheating just by a little bit. Now let's think for a second about what the rational theory of dishonesty tells us. It says that we should consider 3 things. Every time we pass by a gas station, we should think, how much money is there? What's the chance they'll catch us? How much time will we get in prison? We weigh the cost and benefit of those 3 things, and we decide whether to hit the gas station or not. Now, if that's the case, then we can easily get people to cheat more and cheat less. For example, if we pay them more per question, they should cheat more. So we tried that. We paid some people 10 cents per correct question, some people 25, some people 50, $1, $2, $5, $10. You would expect the cheating would increase as the amount of money people can gain per question increases, but it doesn't. Lots of people cheat just by a little bit, and they cheat to the same degree regardless of how much money they get to earn from each question. What about the probability of being caught? We got some people to shred half the sheet of paper, so there's some evidence remaining. Some people shred the whole sheet of paper. Some people shred the whole sheet of paper, leave the room, and pay themselves from a ball of money that had over $100 in it. You would expect the cheating would increase as the probability of being caught would decrease. That's not what we see. Instead, we see lots of people cheating just by a little bit, but uninfluenced by the probability of being caught. So if the economic variables of probability of being caught and amount to be gained don't play out, what would matter? So we thought maybe what happened is that we have these 2 forces. On one hand, we want to think of ourselves as good people. We want to be able to look in the mirror and feel good about ourselves. On the other hand, we want to cheat and benefit from cheating. Now, usually you don't think you could get both of those things at the same time. But human psychology is actually quite flexible. So perhaps what happens is that if we cheat just a little bit, we can benefit from cheating, but we can also keep thinking of ourselves as good people. Think of it as a fudge factor. There's a range in which we can cheat and still feel good about ourselves. Now, if this thing is correct, what we should do is be able to shrink the fudge factor and expand the fudge factor. How would we do this? The idea for shrinking the fudge factor came from a little joke. I'll give you the Jewish version. You can make your own. A guy goes to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, you wouldn't believe what happened. Last time I was in synagogue, somebody stole my bicycle." And the rabbi said, "This is terrible, stealing your bicycle from synagogue. Here is what you do. Next time you come to synagogue, sit in the front row. And when we go over the 10 Commandments, look back at the room. And when we get to thou shalt not steal, see who can't look you in the eyes, who kind of has to bashfully look down. And you know this is your guy." The rabbi is very excited about his own opinion, his own idea. He waits for the guy to come back. After services, the guy comes and the rabbi says, "So, how did it work?" I said, "You wouldn't believe it. It worked like magic. The moment we got to thou shalt not commit adultery, I remembered where I left my bike." You must be wondering what's the experiment in this joke. So we asked people to try and recall the 10 Commandments. We did this in UCLA for about 500 people. None of them, by the way, could recall all 10 Commandments. But what happened afterward? After they tried to recall the 10 Commandments, we tempted them to cheat. Nobody cheated. Now, it wasn't as if the people who remembered more commandments, presumably the more religious people, cheated less, and the people who remembered fewer commandments cheated more. Nobody, after trying to recall the 10 Commandments, cheated. We do the same thing with honor code. We get people to sign. I understand that this short survey falls under the MIT honor code. They sign it, they shred a piece of paper. No cheating whatsoever. And no cheating whatsoever despite the fact that MIT doesn't have an honor code. People just sign something and that convinces them to stop cheating. So we've done lots of things like this to try and get people to cheat less. What about getting people to cheat more? This is not an objective, of course, to get people to cheat more, but for the experimental purposes, what could we do? And the idea here again came to us from a little joke. And the joke is that little Johnny comes back home with a note from the teacher that says that little Johnny stole the pencil from the kid who was sitting next to him. And Johnny's father is very upset. He says, "Johnny, I'm embarrassed and humiliated. We don't behave like this. We didn't teach you like this. You never, never, never steal a pencil from the kid who is sitting next to you. And besides, Johnny, if you need a pencil, you can just ask. I can bring you a dozen of pencils from work." Now, why is this joke amusing? Because I think we all understand that we would have a very hard time taking 10 cents from a petty cash box in the office, but at the same time, we would have a relatively easy time to take a pencil from work. Now, why is it? Why is it that 10 cents will feel very differently than a pencil? So we tried this experiment. Initially, I went around campus and I distributed 6 packs of Cokes in the refrigerator in the dorms. And I came back and I checked how my Cokes were doing. We call this the half-lifetime of Coke. How fast does it take to the Coke to disappear? And you wouldn't be surprised to find out the Coke disappeared very quickly. But then I took a plate with 6 $1 bills and I put it in the same refrigerators. Now the students could have taken a single dollar bill, they could have gone to a vending machine, they could have gotten Coke and change. Nobody ever did. Now this is not really a good experiment. Any psychologist will tell you, any person will tell you, lots of time you find Coke in refrigerators. Finding a plate with $6 bills is kind of a surprise. You don't really know what's going on. So we went back to our experiment with the simple math problems. A third of the people solved it. They solved 4 problems. A third of the people solved it, shredded a piece of paper, came to us and said, "Mr. Experimenter, I solved X problems, give me X dollars," and they cheated by about 2 or 3 questions. The last third, which was the most important one, when they finished, they shredded their sheet of paper, they came to us and said, "Mr. Experimenter, I solved such and such number of problems, give me such and such number of tokens." We paid them in pieces of plastic rather than in money. Then they took these pieces of plastic, they walked 12 feet to the side, and they exchanged them for money. And the question is, will cheating for money, being one step the question is whether cheating for token, being one step removed from money for just a few seconds, get people to cheat more. And in this experiment, people doubled their cheating. Now for me, this is a very worrisome experiment. Because if you think that being removed from money for a few seconds in another medium can liberate people from the moral shackles, think about what happened when it's a longer duration, or something that even more steps removed. Think about mortgage-backed securities, backdating stock options. I think all of those that have multiple steps between them and cash can actually get people to feel as honest, but behave more dishonestly. We also ask the question of what happens when you see misbehavior around you. We call this the Madoff Experiment, but of course we have lots of other examples of people behaving badly. Imagine that you're in a big room and you're taking our test, and all of a sudden, it's 30 seconds into it, you're working on your first problem, you haven't solved one yet, somebody in the first row gets up and said, "Mr. Experimenter, I solved everything. What do I do now?" You say, "You solved everything, you're free to go." That person takes all their money and leaves. What would happen to your morality? Would you cheat any differently? Lots of people cheat more all of a sudden. But there are two possibilities. You could cheat more because all of a sudden we have demonstrated to you that in this experiment you can cheat and get away with it, the rational approach. Or you can cheat because all of a sudden you think it's socially acceptable to cheat. How could we untangle those two? What we did was we played with the outfit of this acting student that we hired to stand up and say that they have cheated. We took a university town that had two universities that were rivals. You can think about Harvard or MIT. We did it with Carnegie Mellon University of Pittsburgh. When the student was getting up and he was wearing the outfit that is representative of the university of everybody else in the audience, cheating went up. But when he was wearing the other university team, cheating actually went down. People all of a sudden said, "Oh, cheating is involved. These other bad guys are the ones who are cheating. I don't want to be part of it," and cheating went down. From this perspective, you can think about what happens in society. What happens when somebody cheats? Well, I think that if they're part of our in-group, if they're part of the group that we associate ourselves with, moral standards might become slightly looser and we might feel more comfortable cheating a lot. On the other hand, if we think of them as being an outsider, it will probably be the opposite. From this perspective, I just want to tell you two lessons I think about this financial crisis. This is basically a picture of conflict of interest. Imagine that I paid you $8 million a year if you could see mortgage-backed security as a good product. Wouldn't you be able to do it? Maybe you wouldn't be able to switch from thinking that they're terrible to thinking that they're wonderful, but wouldn't you be able to think that they're slightly better than before? Of course you would. If the evaluation was fuzzy, if it was difficult, lots of formulas, lots of equations, lots of assumptions, a little bit like our token experiment, hard to figure out, wouldn't you use that fuzziness to go even more into the direction that selfishly fits you? Of course you would. And finally, if like in the Madoff experiment, you saw lots of other people around you behaving in the same way, wouldn't you feel even more justified to behave the same way? So from my perspective, one of the big problems in Wall Street is the conflict of interest and the way it colors people's perception and behavior. They don't have to be bad people, they just have to be people. And unless we eliminate those problems, we're not going to recover. The other point I want to tell you about society is that when I look at my experiments and I say, how many bad apples did I have? We ran about 8,000 people in our experiment so far, and from them we had about a handful of big cheaters, people who claim to have solved 20. And in general, they cost me a few dollars, maybe $70. So few people. At the same time, I had thousands of people who cheated just by a little bit. And they cost me thousands and thousands of dollars. And I think that's actually what happens in society. We have a few criminals, and we have lots of good people that cheat just by a little bit. But in the balance, if we think about economic loss, our economic loss is much higher for the good people who cheat just by a little bit than for the bad people who from time to time cheat by a lot. Finally, you know, we're in Mexico, it's mostly a Catholic country. I want to tell you about the Catholic experiment we're running. So the question that came was about confession. Think about confession. From a rational perspective, if I know that I can get absolved, wouldn't people cheat more, right? Wouldn't this be the rational expectation? But we thought maybe something else has happened. So we did an experiment in which we gave people lots and lots of chances to cheat. And what we see is that for a while people cheat just a little bit. Then at some point people start cheating a lot. They move to cheating all the time. And we think of this as a what the hell effect. You know, you cheat a little bit, you become a big cheater, you say, I'm a cheater, I'm going to hell, I might as well enjoy it. And start behaving like this. And then we gave people a chance to confess. What happens? Well, it turns out that after people starting to cheat a lot, you give them a chance to confess, cheating goes down. They open a new page and cheating goes down. Sadly, it goes up again later, but for a while, it goes down. And I think if we understood this, we might think about all kinds of other ways in which we allow people to open new pages. This was just one example of irrationality. When I went back to the hospital and I told the nurses all the things I've found, one of my favorite nurses, Etty, told me two things that were kind of interesting. The first thing she said was that I didn't take her pain into account. She said, what about me? I was your nurse. I was not enjoying. This was not picnic for her either, taking the bandages off. But very quickly we decided that the goal of a medical treatment is not to optimize the pain of the nurse. You think it's funny, but actually if you look at medical practices, think about how much of it is designed to optimize the physicians. But the second thing, which was, I think, more insightful, she said, look, I didn't think you were right. And doing what you asked me to would be expensive for me. Not in terms of money, but in terms of effort and time. And I think that's actually what happens in most of our lives. We have intuitions about how life works, and checking the intuition, doing something against our intuition is difficult and complex, and we don't think it's working. But if you take one thing from today, I want you to think about the fact that you have lots and lots of intuition about all kinds of things in life. What if they're wrong? What if those intuitions are wrong? Wouldn't it be worthwhile to at least experiment a little bit and try to check out if your intuitions are right? Thank you very much.